Federal Reserve Board, and Karen Dynan, Professor of Economics at Harvard University.
Thank you all so much for being here today. I believe this is one of the final, if not the final panel at today's Vision 2020 conference. Thank you to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for having us, and obviously thank you so much to our panelists for joining today. As the announcer just said, we have with us Karen Dynan, an economist at Harvard University and former Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury Department under President Obama. We also have Claudia Sahm, who is currently the head of consumer research at the Federal Reserve and will soon be the director of macroeconomic policy right here at the Center for Equitable Growth. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And unfortunately, just one programming note, Mercer from the University of California, Irvine, unfortunately was unable to join us, but we will have a robust discussion nonetheless. So I think that you've heard earlier today about sort of the root causes of income inequality, some bold ideas for addressing it and closing the income inequality gap. Here we're going to talk about the linkage between income inequality and the macroeconomy. So Karen, I was hoping that you could start us off by just sort of laying out the landscape for us and sort of describing the channels through which income inequality could potentially damage the broader economy.
Sure. Thank you, Elon. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Claudia. And congratulations to Claudia and to Equitable Growth for getting Claudia. So glad that you're doing a panel on this topic because I think it's a really important topic and needs more focus. Income inequality in the macroeconomy. So a few channels there. First one I want to flag is just the very direct effect that kind of decades of limited income growth in the middle and lower part of the distribution has left kind of just a huge swath of households struggling to save. And I know Claudia is going to talk about those patterns, but saving is such an important vehicle for economic mobility in just this very direct sense, because households that don't have saving are going to find it much more difficult to fund investment in higher education, to start a business, to move to some place to take a new job. All of those things not only hurt those households, but they hurt the productive capacity of our economy. So, very obviously a less skilled workforce, because some people can't get a college education, is going to kind of lower our potential output. But, things like starting a business, being able to move to take a new job, those are all centrally related to economic dynamism, which we know has fallen over the years and has been a problem for growth. Okay, so that's one channel. Next channel is something that, I probably wouldn't have mentioned if you'd asked me this question 10 years ago. It's only something economists really started to think about kind of after the financial crisis and kind of with the economy the global economy really taking so long to recover. And that is sort of growing income inequality has basically kind of depressed aggregate demand. With the logic just being that we know, and it just seems intuitive to people, that households who are higher in the income distribution, they save more, they consume less. So as they get kind of a greater share of income, they're saving more. That kind of has this direct effect on aggregate demand, but kind of all those funds are kind of then swirling around in the economy, kind of creating kind of more demands for investment opportunities. And one effect that has been to kind of bring down what we would call the equilibrium or neutral rate of real interest. Couple of important things to flag there. And one is can make the economy more prone to credit cycles, because you've got investors looking for opportunities. On the supply side, they're going to be kind of more interested in funding riskier investments. And then on the demand side, of course, you've got households, because of the reasons I just described, kind of looking to take on credit because they don't have the income to achieve economic mobility. So that's one sense in which those lower interest rates are a problem for the macroeconomy. Kind of the other sense, and I think Claudia will probably talk about this as well, is that these lower interest rates are, of course, at the heart of this kind of zero lower bound problem we have with monetary policy, whereby we just don't, if we go into a downturn, we don't have as much space as we would have traditionally to kind of fight that recession with monetary policy.
So, Karen, you mentioned the sort of root problem of inability to save as a real issue in households being able to accumulate and form wealth. Claudia, you spent a lot of time looking at sort of the thin buffer that many households have here. Can you tell us how healthy is the American household, and what does that mean for their ability to weather a recession?
Great, thank you. Thank you, all of you. So I just want to start, since Karen thinks I'm going to talk about monetary policy in a little bit, these are my views and not those of the Federal Reserve, and I get to...
Is the Fed going to cut rates again this year?
Yeah. So I get to say that disclaimer for 3 more weeks, so okay. So to answer your question, just broad brush in terms of the amount of financial fragility that we see among American households now, and frankly we've seen for decades and decades, there is no recession that we are ready for, especially given the policies that we have in place. I mean, I had the opportunity, so Equitable Growth and the Hamilton Project put together a volume, Recession Ready, and we talked about strengthening automatic stabilizers. So when you think of, there are opportunities, there are policies that could help buffer for households. There could be a stronger safety net in general that would help not just in a recession, but this building resources over time. So I had worked 10 years on the macro staff forecast at the board, so I really do understand how we look at GDP from quarter to quarter. And worked on consumer spending, so with households. In the last 2 years, I've been a manager for a group in Consumer and Community Affairs that runs the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making. So some of you may have heard about the $400 question. My boss, Dave Buchholz, says at this point I'm completely obsessed with that question and making sure that it's understood. But then I'll talk a little bit about that question, but I think in essence what I said before, there are many households that have very thin financial buffers. And really the numbers are shocking. I mean, and I think this was when the survey began in 2013. They had a question that was, how would you handle a $400 expense, emergency expense? And at that time, half of US adults in this survey, which is representative, told us that they would borrow, sell something, or simply could not pay a $400 expense. That got a lot of attention. That's why you all know about this question. Over time, it has improved. So now we're at about 40% of households. That's still a lot, right? And trying to understand this and unpack it, and it really is like a decision making, what would you do? It doesn't mean these households don't have $400. Some of them don't. Our colleagues who work on the survey of consumer finances at the board, who actually have balance sheet data, they estimate in 2016 that a quarter of US households did not have $400 in easily accessible assets. So I mean, I just can't imagine that reality, and there's plenty of research, both ethnographic and in our survey, that shows that a $400 emergency expense, those happen, and they happen often, and they're extremely disruptive. And so our survey covers various dimensions of economic well-being, and for many Americans now, at this point in the expansion, things look pretty good, but there are definitely parts of the population, the communities that just are in a bad place and very structurally have been for a long time. So I think we'll probably talk more about it, but there's definitely disparities that we see.
And one thing I'd like to just unpack a little bit more that you guys have both mentioned is that, I mean, obviously the idea that, you know, a family doesn't have $400 in their bank account for an emergency is troubling for that family, but how does that translate into a broader economic hit? So Karen, you talked a little bit about the marginal propensity to consume versus the propensity to save and how that could impact aggregate demand. Can you guys talk a little bit more about why this isn't just a micro problem? Why is this a macro problem?
Sure. I mean, I'll start and let Claudia build on it. I mean, it's these thin financial buffers that they basically translate into is kind of fewer or thinner shock absorbers in our economy. So, it makes it difficult for a household to recover from a shock. But if you have kind of a shock to the economy as a whole, and you have kind of lots of households who are having income disruptions, if all of them are having more trouble climbing out of this hole, it's just going to make kind of downturns, kind of longer recoveries, more prolonged till you get back to full employment. So in fact, I think in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we did go through several years where we felt like, people were talking about, is it going to be the traditional V-shaped recovery? Is it going to be a U-shape? Is it going to be like a W with like kind of bouncing up and then bouncing back? But I think a lot of what was behind that was this idea that kind of we weren't prepared to kind of suffer any kind of little setback, given the state of the economy.
Yeah, no, and so I fully agree with all that. And I will say, so my first year forecasting at the board, I was expert on consumer spending, was 2008. So that was the year that I learned how to forecast. That year when all of the models broke, everything that we had said for years,
and I learned how to forecast.
Yeah, and I wasn't there, so I couldn't, but I had to figure out what was going on, and I just kept my head above water. And we have an amazing group of colleagues. So I've thought a lot, and my research very much shifted focus to thinking about how households respond to fiscal stimulus. So while the Federal Reserve does not comment on fiscal stimulus, we do need to understand it, right? Because monetary policy works in an economy where there's other types of policies and shocks. And so I had the opportunity to do quite a bit of research, and there were many different ways that various administrations tried to support households during the recession, in the recovery. And so I learned a lot about, read the research, did research. It actually, 2008 was very hard. There was a lot of suffering that was going on. And I think I'll come back to the point about why recessions are different with the fragility. And I will say, for me personally, in my professional, as a forecaster, it was the recovery that was heartbreaking. Because we kept saying, it's going to come. I had a senior colleague who I'd come in over and over again, and I said, I'm looking at consumers, this doesn't look good. And he's like, Claudia, the macroeconomy always recovers. And I'm like, look, I haven't been here when I've seen this happen, but I'll, not going to take your word for it. Anyways, but it did recover. We are at a place in the expansion where while there are still many structural problems in the economy, we have, by and large, we're in a much better place than we were in 2012 or any time there. So to the question about why, financial buffers are always a problem, and Karen talked about this before, there's just not this opportunity to invest. You can't send your kids to college, you can't start a business, or it's just very hard because you're always trying to deal with these $400 you have savings. In a recession, so by definition, that is a big shock to the economy. So when the unemployment rate rises to 10%, you have a substantial number of families, either someone in the family losing their job, and that isn't a $400 shock. That's a big shock. And so what happens is you have a much larger swath of a lot of people have financial buffers that are thin, but then all of a sudden, a lot of people get hit at once, and then that can be, consumer spending is 70% of the US economy, so that can really start to have bad implications, not just for those households, and then there's a lot more of them, but then for the economy as a whole. And then we really are challenged with the tools to get that under control, to stop it, and not have what happened in the Great Recession, or frankly, any recession.
It seems that where we are now in the economic cycle, obviously we are far off the depths of 2008, 2009, up to through 2012. Right now we're in a cycle where the consumer is leading economic growth. The consumer is the pillar of the economy right now. Does that present any dangers as we think about the potential for the next recession, that so much of the strength that we see today is on the backs of the consumer?
That's entirely correct. And when I'm wearing my hat as a forecaster, because I I, like Claudia, have been trained as a forecaster. In fact, one of the things I have in common with Claudia is we had the same job as she did many years before her. You know, our economy as a whole is looking pretty good. There's some significant risks from abroad, but if I had to kind of name the kind of one thing I'm concerned about internally, it's the fact that it is a consumer-dominated expansion right now. Investment has, you know, pretty much stalled over the last year. I mean, people are investing, but there's been no growth in investment. That's a problem. I mean, it's a problem. You know, for what you mentioned. I mean, it does. You know, generally you want to see kind of growth spread across a lot of sectors because, you know, one sector could be hit by, say, a shock to their income from higher tariffs kicking in or something like that. You know, it also has very kind of concerning consequences for the longer run because if firms aren't investing, then we're not kind of growing the productive capacity of our economy.
Claudia, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'd have to say, I mean, I wouldn't be a macro forecaster. I'd have to turn in my badge if I weren't eternally pessimistic about what could happen in the economy. That's our job, to think about downside risks. You all can like celebrate the happy, but that's not what we're here for. So I guess, I don't take this like too, react too badly to this. So in 2005, the consumer sector looked great in the United States.
That's a good point.
I mean, consumer spending was good. I do not, I mean, there were imbalances in other parts of the economy. So household leverage ratios look much better now. I mean, there's some sad facts to that. Like people have been, like they lost their homes. They haven't been able to have access to mortgages. But if you look, like, just if you look at consumption and consumer spending growth, it was good in 2005. That should not be something to take comfort in. There's other things I'd look at in the economy that would say, I'd maybe worry a little bit more about the business sector than the consumer sector. But the other point I wanted to make, and I think this is one that Equitable Growth and a lot of their research and other groups, the Fed as well, there's a lot under the hood of those aggregate numbers. So at the Federal Reserve, they've started a new project to look at the distribution of wealth across the economy and look at it over time. So this is the distributional financial accounts, and they look at it in many dimensions. And this is not surprising to any of you in the room. Wealth inequality has increased a lot over the last 3 decades. And so when you look at consumer, and Karen talked about, you know, the propensity to consume is different, but the gains, where that spending is, it's not equally distributed. Not everyone has seen those gains. So when you look at those aggregate GDP numbers, not everybody is experiencing that. It is very clear in the data. And one of these things, when we bring the data, and there's been support for a lot of these initiatives, we can actually put some numbers to it. Like we kind of have an intuition about what's going on, but we can unpack it, we can know how big it is, we can know where it's showing up. And then that's, you know, then we have a lot of work to do to figure out why and what next.
Yeah, and if I can just build on what Claudia was saying for a second, I mean, I think one reason, I see this all the time in kind of media coverage, people tell us to don't worry, be happy, is that we see a high aggregate saving rate right now. Mm-hmm. And that means the economy as a whole is saving a bunch. But we don't actually know who's saving. I suspect, I expect it's wealthy people. I suspect it may be boomers who are worried about their retirement. But I suspect maybe some millennials saving to buy homes, but kind of what Claudia's numbers, these distributional financial accounts are telling us is there's still kind of a broad swath of Americans who are not saving despite this kind of pretty high aggregate saving rate.
Right, and Claudia, you've done some work around looking at sort of household finances broken down by race, gender, et cetera. What do those numbers tell you?
There are a lot of differences across the economic well-being, the lived experience across households, families in the United States. Again, not a surprise to anyone. One of the things in our report, see, I brought props. My son was not impressed with these props.
We're impressed with these props.
Yes, so every year we put out a report on household well-being. So this goes with our survey. And I've gotten to work overseeing this report for the past 2 years, and it's hard. Like every single chapter, we look at a lot of different dimensions of economic well-being. the Shed is very into just asking people, like, how are you doing? And without putting a lot of structure on, and then we like take objective measures, or like the $400 question, how would you deal in financial situations? So we have each chapter is a different aspect. Every single chapter, there's such clear differences by race, ethnicity, education, parts of the country, gender in some cases. It comes up over and over, and they're big. And one of the things, at the Fed, we talk a lot about the expansion. This is great, so happy inflation is under control. So you want to start thinking, well, as we push on in this expansion, we get another year, the unemployment rate goes down, it stays down. Are we going to start closing these gaps? Like, these are structural gaps, but like, we haven't run the economy this hot since the 1960s. That was a good time. I mean, the 50s and 60s were a good time for, raising all boats. There were very different policies in place, as we heard in the last panel. And we looked for it. I mean, I so wanted to find something that would look like gaps closing. And we have some colleagues who've looked at much richer employment data, and and kind of, which again shows these disparities, but maybe there's this, like, if you squint hard, you see something. So not in the Shed. Like, these disparities are there. They aren't getting worse. And frankly, over the recovery, and the Shed just starts in 2013, so we can't see, on average, all those groups are trending up. So you see, it's not that, in that case, when you look at race, ethnicity, it's not like these gaps are going apart. We don't have a long time series. Those are like long trends. But there's no sign, and they're big.
Yeah, one of the things you guys have mentioned a couple of times